So now comes something really interesting, and I'm so grateful that Ryan is doing one of his really cool salons as part of this 24-hour live event. Ryan just joined us on camera, and I think, Ryan, if you put into the chat who else is on the panel, then we can all get them into as panelists. So they are not listed under attendees anymore, but listed as official panelists for this session. And I think you have an amazing lineup, so we want them all to be listed here. So just put it in the chat and then we promote them up. Recently, I had the pleasure to host a salon as part of the Intersections series that the National Academies has been organizing. And that's actually a number of events that you might like to watch. So if you go to the 24-hour Science Map events website, which you see here on the screen, and you click on the saloon picture, on the round picture, you will get to a set of videos that were made at that series of events. And it was just marvelous to see science, art, engineering intersect and generate a lot of really cool new ideas, especially during this pandemic time. So I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce Ryan to you, and then I think he will introduce the rest of the panelists. So Ryan is the principal data scientist and aerospace engineer scientist at Astra Associates in Boulder, Colorado. He leads there the data science and machine learning efforts to improve our understanding of the Earth's space environment. He has also been just magnificent in hosting salons and running podcasts. And Ryan, I hope you get to also send us all a link to the Origins podcasts, or I will do it right after I'm done introducing you. And maybe I give it over to you so that you have a full hour. And please do help us understand who else is on the panel.
Thank you, Kati. Really excited to be a part of this event. So it's been fantastic so far, and we're really excited to curate the next hour and a half with something that we've been doing for over a year now. It's about a year and a half that we've been calling Flourishing Salons. And just for this particular event, I'm going to shortly introduce the co-hosts that will be joining me. That'll be Lace Padilla and David Delgado. I know David was having some trouble with audio. David, have you been able to work that out, or are you still having trouble hearing people? And I guess this is not a useful question if you're not able to hear us. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead with introducing what the Flourishing Salons are and what we're going to be trying to do for the next 60 to 90 minutes. And a few of the people who have kindly kind of offered to spend some of their Saturday with us and present some thoughts on a particular theme that we've raised. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen and just talk a little bit about what the Flourishing Salons are. I wanted to give a little bit of an introduction to where this ties into the 24-hour event itself. And Kati, you've done a fantastic job with this. It's been a pleasure both hosting the National Academy of Sciences Intersections 2021 Salon with you. And I'm really excited to kind of advance that and take that to the next level, because after that event, we had a number of people that attended reach out to me just with a ton of enthusiasm about what was the next step, how are we going to continue this conversation. And that's really much the ethos of the Flourishing Salons, is to continue these conversations, have a sustained discourse around these different topics that bring together different sensibilities, the sensibility of art, the sensibility of science, to really think about things from this liminal point of view, or this space in between fields. What I wanted to mention was I did put a link in the chat already to the Origins podcast. The episode I'm really excited about was the one we released this week. So Kati joined me for an episode, and we explored some of her history and some of the history of Places and Spaces exhibit. And so I encourage you to take a look at that, and feedback is always welcome. So I wanted to just describe a little bit about what Flourishing Salons are. Really, the way that I think about the Flourishing Salons is a space for discourse and the creation of a new community of practice. And that community of practice exists at the space between fields, where our most challenging problems and the areas that we're going to make the most progress are those that don't exist within any single discipline. And so that's really where we're trying to go with these flourishing salons. We've been leading them, as I mentioned, since last April. These have been an idea we've been talking about. One of the, I guess, the silver linings of the pandemic was that we just decided to go ahead and start doing these since we were all in the virtual environment. And it actually was a really sustaining thing for myself throughout the pandemic. And I think really generative and creative. I posted a link to the notes for those of you attending, and I'll grab that link in a moment when I'm finished introducing this and share that with you. But you can look back over the past salons that we've held. What we try to do is organize those notes from that into useful resources, and really importantly, the most potent questions that we perceive emerge from those conversations, because I think that that's where the conversation continues. And I think you'll hear Debbie Delgado introduce that topic in just a moment. So the vision for the flourishing salons is to grow a new community of practice. And one of the terms that we've been using that I actually like, because it's a little bit provocative, is anti-disciplinary. That's the space we want to go to. And this does not mean against disciplines, but it means the space between disciplines that inherently requires contribution and conversation from all of these different areas of thought. And so this community of practice is trying to embrace and develop a new sensibility for those that participate that emerges from this enhanced plurality of thought. And we thought that we needed a new approach to do this. And so in order to cultivate that sensibility, we've created this new venue for anti-disciplinary interaction. We're calling it the Salon Series, to kind of use the term that was used when these Salon Series were flourishing tens of decades and centuries ago, as gathering places, cultural exchange. And so what we've been trying to do is to bring together thought leaders across science, engineering, art, and design, with the purpose of sharing ideas, creating new connections and communities, and growing capabilities so that our systems of our society may flourish, and the systems of science and systems of art, so they may flourish together. And so that's where the term flourishing comes from. The goal has always been to create and sustain discussion and catalyze action. And lately, the more kind of directed goal has been to incubate ideas for something that we've been working on with the National Academy of Sciences and David Delgado from the NASA Jet Propulsion Laboratory, called Wonder Workshops. And so we're certainly interested in seeding those ideas now. Now, one of the ideas that we're really focused on is creating this new community practice. And in the theme of today, where we're talking about how do we visualize the things that we don't know or that we aren't aware of or that are subconscious to us, we've been trying to understand this community of practice by visualizing it as a network or a graph structure where we have these relationships. And so I put in a link here, and this is actually a link to the knowledge network that we kind of create through these flourishing salons of who's connected to who, what interactions are happening. And that's one of the ways that we understand what this community is and how we understand where they're moving. Now, a few of the objectives, really to understand what it means to be anti-disciplinary. What does it mean to be liminal in this world where we have to speak in these spaces between fields? And to think about that as not a set thing to achieve, but a playbook, a living, evolving process that requires us to constantly reflect and refine. We want to create a community practice that thinks about these things and consistently converses about them. We want to create leaders of convergent thinking that not only contribute to the flourishing salons of community practice, but also takes that message, those sensibilities back to their networks and helps propagate these ideas of connection and plurality. And then finally, to spark new wonder workshops around certain themes that emphasize engagement and activation. Now, we have kind of a proposal that we've always had in mind for the flourishing salons, which was a foundation for these things that are happening, where we would like these to be in-person events that happen periodically, perhaps in the DC area as a hub. At the moment, these have, of course, been virtual gatherings, and we've actually found that they're very effective, and people have benefited a lot from these. So I hope that can contribute to you as well. We'd also like these to become templates for people who want to create these salon instances in their own communities in different areas. And so helping people understand how to convene these salons and create these discussions that are at the space between disciplines. Now, I wanted to quickly, and I don't want to use too much of the time today, because really these salons are about freewheeling discussions where we let the conversation evolve organically, and people, it really depends on the quality of contribution from each of you. So I want to step out of that limelight and let you contribute. But I want to give a short history to let you know where we've been. So we held our first salon in April of 2020, and this was something that just started out of the first month of the pandemic from here in the US, and it was really rewarding. We continued to grow the salon and started to understand how we could understand what our community is. And so we started to found this knowledge network as a way to visualize what we didn't know about our community. In October, the network grew to include a lot of people that were very excited to have involved. So this was including the cultural programs of the National Academy of Sciences, the American Geophysical Union, the MIT Media Lab, NASA, National Science Foundation, the Leonardo Institute as well. And it's just been really exciting to see how many groups embrace this idea. In December, we launched something during the American Geophysical Union meeting, which was kind of the first inaugural event that we called Art at the Science. So basically, this was an idea for bringing artists and designers to scientific conferences and creating discourse around the scientific artifacts that were being presented. We launched that at the American Geophysical Union fall meeting, and that was really exciting. I think there was excellent participation. The artists really embraced it, and I think the science really benefited from it as well. We hope that this can be a model for future conferences that we can invite artists to be a part of the conversation. Just this past April, we've partnered with a number of different academic institutions to kind of explore what ArtSci looks like in an educational setting. This was a nascent program that we talked with Sarah Rosengard at the Art Institute of Chicago of how do we create this conversation and let the salons be something that helps the educational institutes that we have. And then finally, just this past October, as Kati mentioned, we hosted as part of the cultural program of National Academy of Sciences Intersections 2021 event, a salon that was called Seeing the World with New Eyes via Data Visualizations. And really that's the seed of today's discussion. Some of the really exciting conversations that happened there sparked a couple of ideas for how we could extend the conversation. And that's what brings us to today. So what I wanted to do was just share the notes document just very briefly, and I'll grab the link for that so that people can contribute. But this is where we've been kind of putting the ideas for this. And so this is part of this Science Maps and Macroscopes event. And the theme for today is mapping knowledge, but also thinking about it in the context of mapping what we don't know. How do we put on display the things that we're not aware of? So rather than introduce that concept myself, there are a number of people online who have really taken an interest in speaking about that. And what I'll do is I'll let my co-hosts, David Delgado and Lace Padilla, introduce themselves, and then we'll jump into a few provocative lightning talks to spark the discussion today. So I'll stop there and I'll hand it over to David and Lace.
David, I could go first if you're.
Sure, that's great. I can hear now.
Okay, great.
Yeah, please, Lace, go ahead and I'll follow you.
Sure. Thank you so much for arranging such a fabulous event. It really connects to me on multiple levels. My name is Lace Padilla. I'm an assistant professor at the Cognitive and Information Sciences Department at UC Merced, and I study how people understand visualizations with uncertainty. That discipline integrates cognitive science and visualization research, but that's not where I started. I actually started as an artist. I have a master's degree in graphic design, and I had a career in art before I switched over to examining visualizations of uncertainty. So I'm deeply interested in this topic and excited to hear the panel discussion.
Hey, that was great. Really nice to meet you, Lace, and thank you so much, Ryan, and everybody else on the call. I can't wait to talk to everybody about this really interesting subject. So my name is David Delgado. I am a cultural strategist and a visual strategist at the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. What that actually means is that, I work as a visual strategist with a group of about 8 people, and we communicate the ideas that are happening in NASA missions or in sort of the technology that's being developed in a way that we try to humanize things, right? So we try to look at things conceptually and find the common ground that really kind of relates to just people in their normal day within their normal set of curiosity. And doing that is always like this really interesting challenge for us, but it ends up, in like an art piece or a piece of design, or in like graphic design, or usually some sort of design or art form that, hopefully brings like new attention and excitement to it, that may not have happened inside the scientific description. But yeah, I'm just really interested in this subject because it has so much to do with the way that we think at JPL, because, you know, a lot of times people there are doing things for the first time, you know, and if something hasn't been done before, you're constantly in this state of wondering what's too far, you know, or, you know, how do we go about dealing with problem solving in an area that we really don't have like a huge amount of understanding in? And, you know, what are the things we can rely on when we're kind of dealing with general uncertainty? And, you know, and I think that is as important for us as designers and artists as it is for the scientists, you know, who are testing new areas, and the engineers. And so that's a little bit about me, but very interested to talk more about the conversation in general. Thank you.
Thanks so much, David. I love the idea you touched on, because this theme kind of emerged from some of our pre-conversations to this. And I think the pandemic is kind of a perfect example of how do we think in these spaces where we don't have a lot of prior information. We don't have a lot of prior constructs or foundations or frameworks to think about. And so it's such a topical conversation. I'm really excited to bring that to the discussion here. What I want to do is start off with these short 1 to 3 minute lightning talks that a few people have indicated an interest in providing. I know, David, you're one of those individuals. I'm going to let Philip Beasley go first, because Philip is kindly coming to us from the airport, just about to board a flight. So Philip, why don't you kick us off today? And thank you so much for making.
Thank you so much, colleagues, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be here with you. I'm just going to put some text into the chat. Here we go. And these 6 bullet points form the basis of a lightning talk. The Living Architecture Systems Group imagines data as being something like a forest, in the sense that we can be surrounded by the most delicious, extraordinary, frightening, thundering, disabling kinds of immersive experience if we treat information as a veritable living system. And I want to suggest that there might be 4, 5, 6 ingredients that might be interesting to touch on here. One is Cathy Borner's quite revolutionary conception of deeply embodied macroscopes, which of course is the inversion of a microscope, and the sense that complex information could be assembled as a kind of a whole instrument is one that I think is a profoundly important kind of witness test. Secondly, I think the sense that we could look at dreaming and even pareidolia and machine empathy. When I say pareidolia, I mean looking in clouds and seeing bunnies and carrots and all kinds of animals, of working with the liminal space that moves back and forth between pathfinding and accuracy and boundaries, and yet hallucinating as well, and being a bit delirious and enjoying the sense of dizzy, can be a tremendously enabling quality. Perhaps we could move that into even the space of treating data as a veritable living system, and having a kind of confidence that it is time now to start terms of reference that refer to homeostasis and health and outright emotion and unapologetic sensitivity in the world of information processing and interactive systems. Living systems offer us language which move us far beyond the humanist tradition of trying to make walls and boundaries and making things clear. And instead, we could look at dissipation and openness and inclusion in a kind of a hybrid confidence. I want to suggest that could introduce some very specific terms such as subtlety, entropy, the kinds of dispositions that make minute shifts fundamentally open the world. We know what it's like when we just wink our eye, or when we glisten, or when we change our posture very slightly, and how enormously powerful those kinds of remarkable qualities can be. And that leads us to the sense that irony is a tremendously important part of dealing and thinking with data and interactive systems. Likewise, if we deal with irony and comedy, then perhaps we could also absolutely embrace tragedy, that is, the fundamental art that unites us with the secret causes of things. And so I hope that that might foster some thinking about some new terms. For example, rather than the clarity and the empty space of a world in which we are dedicated to being individual agents, perhaps the word for space itself could be removed. We could use an older medieval word, ether, which connotes a kind of a fullness and a participation rather than needing to cut and control. So I regret that this is so rushed, but I hope that those thoughts might be a contribution.
Thank you, Philip. I think many of the terms you raised touch on exactly what we're trying to do with the Flourishing Commons, which is allow for more subtle interpretations, allow for different ways of knowing, to have voice. And I think the formulation of things as living systems is incredibly useful. While we still have you, I'd love to ask if there are examples in your own work where we could kind of give this some concreteness, these ideas that you talked about.
The Grove and the accompanying film Cradle, which is just being dismantled at the Venice Biennale for Architecture this year, is a good example of a living, immersive system in which there's a physical environment, but there's also a deep, projective world which plays out pluripotency into multiple dimensions. The test bed, Amatria, at the Leahy Hall in Indiana, within Andy and Patty's lab, is another example in which there's a deeply embodied physical matrix, but it's capable also of a myriad of projections and virtual possibilities. We've only begun in very modest ways to scratch the surface on what that kind of combination of art and science, deliberately traversing that boundary, can offer. But I would suggest that those are a couple of examples. I love the sense of projection, and I also love the sense of deep embodiment and physical thinking that's embedded in both of those.
Thank you, Philip. I grabbed a link, I hope, to the Grove Cradle, exhibit that you mentioned, and I'm excited to dig in further with that. If you have questions, this is meant to be an open conversation. So if you have questions, please post them in the chat. And as we get your questions coming in, we will promote you to a panelist so that you can share them live. We'll go on next to Brian Brophy, I believe, has also offered to give a lightning talk. And Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts and on the idea and the theme of mapping what we don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. Thank you, Philip, for displaying all of those words that you gave to us, those concepts, while you were doing them at the same time. It's just the ether, the living systems of the airport that you're in, the machine empathy that was going on in the cockpit of the airplane that's coming to pick you up, and just the subtlety of your communicating with us in this moment. Thank you, man. That was pretty cool. Yeah, I'm the director of Caltech Theater. I just got out of a rehearsal for a brand new musical that we're doing called From the Earth to the Moon, written by Grant Remmon and Cole Remmon. And since Philip put something in the chat, I'm going to put something in the chat too. So one of the things that I was working on today was sort of these viewpoints about how we develop new work. And so in this new musical, it's an adaptation of Jules Verne's 1865 From the Earth to the Moon. And in that, today, what we were working on was these different viewpoints that Anne Bogart, maybe some of you know who she is, but she developed a way of developing movement and interaction on the stage. And so these were the things that we were working on today as we were singing the songs, as we were moving about the stage and all of that. So these are things that I find of ways of mapping, the sort of an asymmetrical cognitive frame, right, that we can use in our bodies, right? We can use these ways in our bodies to understand and develop new forms of knowledge in many ways. One of the things I've been really interested in lately is there's an astrophysicist from the University of Illinois. We were talking a lot about how do you get across condensed matter physics to an audience, right? So I'm really sort of fascinated with David Delgado and I talk about, how do you get people to understand the lumpiness of gravity, right? How do we understand gravitational waves? So from a sensorial point of view, I can run into two of these just frames of reference, frames of mind, that there's just so many different layers and levels that we can understand really complicated material. So I'm just really keen about continuing to explore ways of knowing, sort of this embodied cognition. I know people use this phrase, but I like it because how do we understand things just beyond our conceptual or our abstract? How do we understand it through the body and through all these multiple sensations, non-equilibrium dynamics? How do we sort of navigate that as a human in order to have it be part of my life, but also to share the sort of enthusiasm that scientists have for their science and how do they connect with the world? Because I find that scientists, for me right now in this moment, are one of the most important folks that are doing work in terms of the chemists that are working on virus theory, or the microbiomes, or the space exploration that's happening at JPL. There's all these things that will sort of break open this new space, and what I like to call this moment of the joy of regathering. The joy of regathering. We've been through nearly 2 years of the plague years, and so people are coming out of it. They're all messed up. Their neurodiversity is even more heightened. Their social anxiety is better. Who is being seen? Who is being heard? And in this joy of regathering, how do we kind of reconstitute our communities through science and art? And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. How do we reconstitute 25 people that are in the cast, the pit band and everything? So how do we reconstitute not just this musical with people from JPL and Caltech and postdocs from Caltech, but just all of us too. I love this idea, Brian, what you're talking about, the flourishing workshops, and I'm just coming to that right now in the community of practice of that. And I think it's really, really important that when artists and scientists are talking, being together, linking up ideas, and just taking some anxiety off of the rest of us too. It's like, yes, it's going to get better. Yes, it's going to get better, because we need to know it's going to get better. So the joy of regathering and of new information and how we map it all, and I find it fascinating. Thank you for inviting me, Brian. I really appreciate it.
Brian, thank you so much. You touched on so many things that I'm interested to talk about, and I think loops in a number of other people that have joined the call today. The first thing I want to mention is this idea and this language of reconstituting and reconstituting our communities is so important. And I find it very revealing that when I talk, and I've done this with people on Origins across a number of different backgrounds, but when I think about the people who use the language of beauty and that language enriched with that the most, it's not just artists. I get that from physicists just as much. And so you talked about the astrophysicists trying to conceptualize condensed matter physics, these very difficult things to constitute. And I also think about the people who pioneered quantum physics as inherently having to use language of beauty and spirituality, even, and mysticism to describe some of these ideas of complementarity and things. I also want to touch on something you alluded to, and that Philip Beasley and David Delgado have been talking about, which is this idea of physical thinking. And I'd like to invite Joanne Kuchera-Morin to maybe say a few words about that, because I know that she has talked a lot about and done a lot of research into how scientists encounter their information in terms of peripersonal space and beyond. So Joanne, do you want to say a few words about that? And then I see that Lace had her hand up, and I can go back to you in a moment.
Okay, Lace, did you want to say something first before I talk?
I had a question for Brian, but I think you can go ahead. We can, open it up for discussion after.
Okay. Well, I'm a media artist, and I'm in the California Nanosystems Institute at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And you see my instrument behind me, which is a 3-story cylinder in a near-anechoic chamber. And the picture that you see are actually the visualization, and you can't hear it, the sonification of the time-dependent Schrodinger's equation, splitting a hydrogen-like atoms in electron into superposition. One of the things that's so exciting for me working with my physicist and my material scientist, and to have a conversation about the fact that everything that we process in our bodies is frequency vibrations. They're frequency relationships that we hear, that we see, that we interact with. And when we start to talk about mapping things that we don't know, how can we bring those frequency relationships down into our senses so that we can understand them, so that we can experience them? This gets into many interesting aspects of the particle wave duality and the fact that I believe that we are connected, we are waveforms, there's a connection among us that exists. To be able to map this language, to be able to understand quantum information in the way that my scientists understand, I won't be able to understand it until I see it and hear it. But if I can get their exact data and do Fourier transforms and bring it into the senses so that we can all experience it, maybe we can make a language where we can all communicate with one another, where we can break the barriers of our disciplines and we can actually understand this intuitively and what it actually means. So these are kind of the exciting things we're trying to do in the California Nanosystems Institute, and to have these dialogues as artists with our scientists and our engineers to come with a way that we can all speak the same language. And that for me deals with a lot of compassion, caring, understanding, and knowing who and what we are, and being very careful about how we navigate our senses through our living experience while we're on this planet for this time. Anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this gathering. It's just absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. It's a pleasure to have you online as well. Lace, I'll step aside and let you ask Brian your question.
Sure. So Brian, I got really excited when you were discussing reconstituting these kind of collaborative spaces. And I think that the really interesting part of this specific topic is that mapping what is unknown could be a perfect application for re-envisioning how people work together across different disciplines. And I think part of the reason for that is there's many types of uncertainty that scientists literally don't know how to quantify at this point. So there's areas in which different fields could deeply add knowledge that are incapable of calculating right now. But my question for you is that it seems like you're so good at organizing different peoples with different roles and so forth. Do you have thoughts or advice about how to ensure that we're capitalizing on all the greatest parts of artists and all of the benefits of scientists so that we can use our best skills together rather than all doing the same thing? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. I love what Joanne just said. This time on this, our time, this time on this planet. I just this time that we have on this planet, not some other time. Well, for example, one of the people in the musical that we're doing right now is making a mass spectrometer. She's doing what is it? She's making one of the cameras that's going to the moon, and she's actually one of the lead singers in this production, right? So she has these concomitant skills, these skill sets where she has this sort of amazing resonance that she has as a singer, right? And the tonality that she has, but she also has this other skill, which is very precise. And it all has to do with measurements and observations and mechanical reproduction of things. So I'm not quite sure, I don't know what the question was, Lace, but I think it's about sort of this reconstitution of how, in sort of moving forward right now at this time, that we have to inform each other and we have to actually sit with each other, and engineers sit with me, even though they might not want to, till they get them to talk about what it is that they're passionate about. Why are you going to Triton, like one of the moons of Neptune? Or what is it about that? Like, well, here's the design. Like here's what it is. No, tell me about that. What is that? Well, no, here's the design. This is what we do. Can you? So it's about the visual data, the visual representation of that data or their blueprint for the probe, not the probe, but what's it called? The orbiter. Yeah. So the orbiter, like, what does that look like? So how can that data that they're giving to us as a blueprint, that a lot of people who are engineers will understand that, but how can he explain it to us so that we can join in on that journey with him or her or them in ways that will enrich my life in many ways. So I think it's having conversations with people that don't want to necessarily have conversations. I don't know if that makes any sense, but there's something about finding that space. Somebody said today about avoiding chaos or resisting chaos. That was like one of the things we were talking about today. How do you resist chaos and putting together a musical? Because all around it, there's all this movement, but how do you resist chaos? And that way you can find some kind of order while you're always resisting the chaos. So I think it's about having people discuss really hard things with people that may not have the same level of awareness or the different kinds of knowledge base that they have, with other people that might have softer skills that don't engage with that. How can you amplify the curiosity of those that have the soft skills, but also for those that have the hard skills to be able to develop those softer skills so that we can understand a little bit deeper why we have to go to Venus, for example.
That's great. Thank you. It sounds like you're advocating for getting people in the room and talking to one another, trying to manage the chaos and, adapt from the knowledge that you're learning from other people.
Yeah.
Which is this salon, the way I interpret it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, for sure.
Thanks, Brian. I was just trying to post in the chat something. There's a really fantastic talk that was given by Sarah Hendren, and she dove into this idea that I think relates to your idea of hard and soft skills. And she actually does the framework for the way that she speaks about it is critique and repair. And she talks about there being these different sensibilities of critique, which is coming from this humanities or this artistic side, and this repair, which is kind of the prototyping, putting something out there, creating something. And how do you navigate those two sensibilities? And I really appreciate you kind of bringing the conversation there. David, you have a question.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to follow up on what Brian was saying, with the hard and soft skills. And I think it's just so interesting too, Brian, what you're doing. And because you get firsthand to see people's experience and how working with people who may have a tremendous amount of hard skills, and they start, working with you and kind of experiencing perhaps soft skills at a certain depth that they haven't done for many years or perhaps even their whole lives. And do you think that, rather than looking at hard skills and soft skills existing within different people, when people start to grow, that other side of themselves, what is that? Maybe it isn't always a balance, but what do you think that brings to the picture in people's lives when they bring up the other side that they may have been lacking or have developed less than the other?
I think that's a great question, David, because we all have certain discarded energies, right? We have certain discarded or disowned, if you will, disowned energies in ourselves that we put away. We put away in a drawer, we put away in a closet, or we put it underneath our couch, or wherever we put that thing, or we repress it. We repress that thing that kind of simmers underneath the surface. And oftentimes it turns into rage with certain people, right? It'll turn into animosity. It'll turn into a certain kind of anger because they sort of discarded a certain part of themselves that maybe when they were trying to get into MIT or Caltech or IIT in India, that you had to put away all these other parts of yourself that really made you the most happy. When I was working with the Indian Institute of Technology folks, is that it was so hard to get into those IITs. It was just so intense. So when they actually got there, they were like toast. I call them they're like toast because they were just exhausted. And so they put away everything that they really loved. Maybe they loved Carnatic music, or maybe they loved a certain art form that their parents didn't really encourage them to do. And so they had to put all these things aside. And I think it grows into kind of an animal, like a woolly, whatever kind of animal you want to think about it. But it's that thing that never gets fed. so it just kind of sits in the corner growling, and will oftentimes erupt in like the strangest ways. People that I really enjoy, hanging out with this person. And all of a sudden something happens. There was a trigger moment. I know that I've had that with certain folks at Caltech. Well, one in particular, remember I was at an event and he looked at me, he's like, "Oh, you're the guy that works with all the ham bones." And meaning the theater people. And I'm like, and my wife was with me. She kind of squeezed my arm, like, just, don't take that. But I kind of, at the time, I think a little more involved in my thinking, so I'm not as reactive. But I think that was something that maybe he had repressed in himself, because he had to get through an intense undergraduate experience here. And he had to repress a lot of that. So then it comes out in the strangest moments, like triggers, and he gets angry at something that they want, right? So I'm looking at David, and David has a certain expressivity about himself, and I've never mastered that, right? I've always locked my little emotions off in the corner, and then I watch David, like, oh my God, he's like flourishes with this knowledge and, this asymmetrical cognitive, the waltz that he does when he plays. It's like, oh, I love that. And as opposed to me, going, oh, I love that, and I'm curious about that. I want to find out more about that. I want to develop more like a Delgado or whoever. I just go like, oh, I don't like him. He's weird. He does this kind of thing. I'm not quite sure what it is, right? So it's like a weird kind of emotional backfire in some way, right? So I think that's kind of what happens, I think, with folks, is they put away these other skill sets they have. I talk a lot about, frames of knowledge, and the Howard Gardner kind of version. And I find that really helpful with our community that struggles with such an intense amount of neurodiversity and it's something about that goes back to mental health too. And that's why I think that the theater and the performance and the musicals that we end up doing, storytelling, kind of unleashes other aspects of themselves that they've repressed. So I'm all for liberation of those disowned selves and bringing them into conversation and curiosity. And I love this idea of critique and repair, because critique is more, it can be very curious. That I have a critique. If I don't know anything about your condensed matter physics, I think Grant Remmen is on the call here. Grant tries to explain his theoretical physics. He's a postdoc at the Kavli Institute up at Santa Barbara. So whenever I have a chance, I really want to dig into what his science is and how does it relate. And it relates to me in how I understand it. He understands that on just so many different deep levels, and building on this knowledge base, this conceptual framework that goes back to Socrates and the pre-Socratic thought, and that's deep. And so this knowledge base, how do I interact with it? Otherwise, I kind of feel left out. Even if I want to know more about what they know, because I'm limited in my understanding of certain things, and I'm usually the guy who says, I don't understand what you're saying. I'm going to take the chance to be humiliated, in certain situations where everyone's going, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. It's like, do you? It's like, no, but I'm not going to say I don't. Right. So that I love the idea of critique and repair, but I think it comes out of curiosity and the questions that we ask and how we repair and what way do we repair.
Thank you. I love the exchange. I've got so many ways that I'd like to go with that. But are other people on the call? The question that I want to ask that kind of builds on this, and maybe this will invite some others to contribute to this, is in terms of this interaction that you described, Brian, of artists sitting with scientists, working on a musical was the context that you provided. But I think of how we allowed that interaction to happen is through these boundary navigating objects. And I like to think of those very capaciously. That could be physically a graph, maybe, that people are sitting down looking together, or it could be a performance that they're working on together. And I would like to ask and open up for conversation, what are the boundary navigating objects that you have been a part of or been, if you think about it in that framing, what comes to mind in your work that's been particularly effective in kind of exposing what are the things that you may not know? Do people have good examples of these kind of boundary navigating objects that help you communicate with others more effectively?
Can I just drill down a little bit? When you say objects, boundary navigating objects, what do you mean by that object? Sorry.
That's fine. Yeah, it's a good clarification. I mean that very widely. And that could be when I'm working with someone, it could be a graph that I'm looking at. Here are the numbers, here's the information that I have, here's how I'm representing that information. But it could be anything. It could be, a much broader definition of that. So I'm curious what have helped people in their work. And Stuart, I see you have your hand up. Welcome, by the way.
Thank you. Thanks, Ryan. I'm really glad to be here. And thank you, David, for bringing me in. And I wanted to say hello to Philip. Also, I don't know if you remember, we met back when I was an in-house futurist at Arup about a decade ago. Yeah, look, so just quickly to provide my context, because I think where we're coming from makes a big difference to our answers and our perspectives here. I'm a professional futurist. I've been involved in that field for about a generation and full-time in it for the last 15 years. I'm a design professor at Carnegie Mellon, a fellow at the World Economic Forum, and currently based in LA. And I'm mentioning this because I'm trying to meet people in Southern California. It's not my usual environment, but I'm based in LA as a Berggruen Fellow at the University of Southern California. And the kind of practice that we've been involved in for the last decade and a half, I think can really be very well described in the terms that you just offered, Ryan, as boundary object creation. My interest was piqued immediately on hearing about this session and its themes of mapping both knowledge and the unknown, because I think in a way what futures work is, that is to say, looking systematically and creatively at things that haven't happened yet, or that could happen, and the implications of those things for our lives, our communities, our industries, our countries, wherever you want to draw that boundary. That involves, it's basically edgecraft. It involves walking the boundary of what is known or what we think we know, and looking constantly to the horizon of what might turn out to be true as events unfold. And it made me think of this quote, and I actually kind of almost fittingly don't really know where this quote came from, but I've tried to track down the sort of provenance and can't find an authority for it. But it's this observation that the larger the island of knowledge, the longer the shoreline of wonder. The larger the island of knowledge, the longer the shoreline of wonder. I love this quote. I mean, because I think it makes very concrete and sort of visual something that we maybe all know to be true from our own experience. The more we know, the more we realize we don't know. But I think it also gives us a way of thinking about what walking that boundary might entail. And in the case of the kind of work that I've been doing as a futurist for the last decade and a half, the sorts of things that we try to do in walking that line have included creating experiences of possible futures that you can have in the present. Bye-bye, Philip. Safe journey. I'll shut up in a second, but I just want to quickly sort of finish this offering. Create what we call experiential futures. So really living in that contradiction of trying to explore things that we don't and can't know because they haven't happened yet, by bringing them to life in the present in the form of physical artifacts, which purport to be from the future. And people may have come across this in the form of what some of my colleagues call design fiction or speculative design, sort of thinking through emblematic artifacts that are purportedly from the future, or experiential futures more broadly as we see it, which includes immersive experiences where you step into and spend time in a room. We call this a time machine, where you spend 15 or 20 minutes or half an hour in the year 2050, a particular version of the year 2050, and then come back to the present to talk about what you thought about it and what it discloses for us in the present. And the last thing I wanted to say about this is that I think there is a sense in which my background academically was in the history and philosophy of science originally. So this idea of different ways of knowing is very resonant for me, but it occurs to me while in the course of this conversation that ways of knowing is, in a sense, a little bit of a, it's a little bit of a colonizing claim. Part of what we're talking about here is ways of not knowing, ways of being okay with not knowing, ways of wondering. And hypothesizing vividly is a way of not knowing and being okay with not knowing by asking what if performatively. And so, I mean, to be a little more specific, because I haven't shown you any, slides or I can't take you to these experiential scenarios I'm describing, but I can show you a tool that my dear late colleague, Jeff Watson of USC and I created, which is a card game called The Thing from the Future. And it's basically a combinatorial prompting system with just 3 suits in it, 3 different kinds of card. And it asks you to imagine a particular kind of future, which may be queer or regimented or thrilling, a particular kind of object, an artifact, so to speak, to a sort of almost literal sense of boundary object, which could be a device or, what is that, a monument or a public service announcement. I mean, there are dozens of these. And a theme, an aspect of life or of, what we're inquiring into, which could be justice or the environment or space, or any other field of inquiry. So in a thrilling future, there is a public service announcement related to justice. What is it? And gameplay revolves around asking yourself or prompting yourself and your fellow players to play with those ideas, with that combination. And there are thousands or millions of them, depending on how many inputs you put in. So the last point I wanted to make about that is that I think that it's not just a way of knowing that we're interested in when we walk along the boundary, when we walk along the shoreline of wonder. It's a way of not knowing, and a way of not knowing specifically that we can embrace is play. If you try to behave in water the way you behave on land, if you try to walk or run in water, it doesn't tend to work. So we need to learn to swim. We need to learn to move differently in that context. And I think that play is a way of dealing with what we cannot know. And so that's what I wanted to suggest. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Stuart. David, you had a question for Stuart.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart. I just always love listening to you speak about pretty much anything. But that idea of the larger the island, also the longer the shoreline of wonder is just really amazing. And as a futurist, I'm just wondering, like, do you make a distinction in between the idea of the future and imagination? Are those the same things to you when you map, the future? Do you consider it mapping an imagination of a group? And is there really a future? What is that?
Wow. Well, so I mean, they closely relate in my mind, for sure. I mean, I think the capacity to picture or to conjure and to fantasize about things that haven't happened yet is in part an imaginative capacity. But I think imagination is maybe a broader idea in that, you could also imagine what it might be like to be in a past, or to be a different person, or to have a different experience, someone on the other side of the world, or someone sitting next to you, and there are many other uses of imagination too. So I think it's maybe more of a, it's a slightly more focused, although still vast, site of application of imagination. But part of what is significant about it, I mean, when we're talking about futures, we're talking about things that are connected organically to what has come before. So it's not as if we, sort of start with a baseline of 0 and imagination is sufficient or kind of adequate all by itself as a way of trying to grasp the future, grasp, the yet to be. It has to be tied to what has come before. So the more history you know, the better a futurist you can be, in my experience, and looking around. And so I think there's a way in which it's imagination plus other ways of knowing, which is part of the boundary walking or the shoreline wandering function that we're talking about. It's not just looking out to the horizon, it's also looking at the sands that are shifting under your feet.
Sort of like a informed imagination, I guess.
Yeah, I'll just jump in and say that I think one thing that inspired me about what Stuart just spoke about is I think that there's a lot of similarities between that practice and many different types of simulation that happens in science. So with simulation, the better your priors are, the better input data, the better the simulation. And there's lots of creative activities that happen in that simulation where you're looking at multiple different scenarios. But I think that's a really interesting edge object, I can't remember how Ryan was saying it, that could be used as a really great tool, because I think that many people, while they might not call it, a futuristic practice, they do some practice of simulating future events, or going through the activity that could relate across discipline fairly easily.
Yeah, thank you, Lace. I'm reminded as you were talking about world building, essentially, Stuart, N.K. Jemisin is kind of a speculative fiction writer, and I think she does a fantastic job describing the process of world building. And one of the things that she really centers in that discussion is what I think of as the need for ethnography. With increasing difference, I think she writes that you have to increase immersion. And so I think that's immersion not only in the history of things, but also in the immediate, with the things that we're not normally immersed in. So I think, the way that I think about this is kind of what's the curriculum of the future for the person who's going to walk between these fields. And I keep coming back to these skill sets that come from ethnography and being able to, immerse yourself into another culture and learn that way. And so I think in this kind of abstract term, that ethnography can be kind of this boundary navigating object, the skills that allow you to do that. David, I saw your hand pop up. Did you want to chime in?
Well, yeah, it's actually, I was just listening to Lace, and I thought it was so interesting, cognitive science and futurism, and, looking at ethnographies too, actually now making a trio, is that, isn't that kind of like in a similar way what cognitive science also does? And I see Lace and Stuart almost in having similar jobs in some way. Lace, I'm sorry, I don't know you, but I heard you say cognitive science. And because I really love listening to people who know about cognitive science, because it really is in a huge way a navigation tool, right? Like this, how do we deal with the, Joanne, in navigating our senses, navigating challenges, and just by understanding ourselves, which brings me to Ryan was saying too, is a lot of times ethnography is really thought about like understanding a different culture, but like so much of the time too is like if we conducted ethnographies on our own life or our own culture, we start to realize, or our own brain, right? Like there's all of these hidden things that are shaping the way that we respond and behave and navigate. And so, no, I don't have anything else to say. I just thought it's really interesting. I'd never thought about cognitive science through the lens of futurism, and it seems like there's a lot there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think part of what we do is we're trying to, imagine what people would do when presented in novel scenarios. So we need to know more about what's going on in the brain to predict how they will respond when there's another pandemic or when a hurricane's coming, something like that. So it requires a lot of what Stuart was talking about, which I related to, and now I have some different language to kind of express the same thing. So I thought that was useful.
Joanne,
I just wanted to add something. Yeah, I think what's interesting with, with the people that I work with, because the media arts, I'm a composer, and we bring music, visual arts, computer science, and electrical engineering together in my program, but we work with the physicist and material scientist. And one of the things that is interesting to us is each of us understand our own discipline-specific language, but we try to communicate what their language is through our language. And doing that kind of translation really kind of brings it, as I always tell my students, because they're going, how can we know all these different areas? And I said, it's funny, if you know one discipline, you just map the same ideas that you do in that discipline to another discipline, and you can almost learn that other discipline. Maybe it's taken you 15 years to learn the one, you might be able to learn the other discipline, in a few years. You might not be deep. It's almost like being a specialized doctor, but you know the whole body. So how do you find the commonalities among the language? And for what we're trying to do is say, well, how do we now map those commonalities into our sense relationships so that we can start to understand them and make kind of a general language that we can all talk together about the same thing. And I mean, some of the things that have happened, in working, I've had nothing past Algebra 2 in high school, and I'm mapping the Schrodinger equation. And, having my physicists come in, and after we mapped it, and them saying, wow, you're not showing us anything we don't know. And we probably know it better from the math, because this is basic quantum mechanics, but we never thought we'd see it visceral and real in front of our eyes. And so I said, well, so now can we have a dialogue? Can a composer that knows nothing past algebra 2 in high school have a dialogue with a Nobel physicist and talk about common things? And it's kind of like those kind of mappings really, really are the exciting aspect. And one of the things, because we're talking about cognitive science, some of my students are really into some of these cognitive scientists that talk about strangeness and how the strangeness is the most important aspect of things. And I hear my scientists always saying they're looking for the anomalies. And so anyway, it's just all really interesting way that we can have this kind of community dialogue that we're having.
John, can I ask you a quick question? I think what is really special about what you do is that you have an interface where people can physically engage in the data. And so I'm wondering, do you find that using this physical, I'm not sure if you want to call it a metaphor, but allowing people to physically engage with information, is that very useful to make these cross connections for things that are just hard to articulate, having them experience it in their body?
Absolutely. It's the visceral and the real. I mean, like I said, it's really all vibration. It's all frequency vibration. And when we start thinking that, we hear my geoscientists say that we can feel vibration of a 15-minute earthquake up to 100 cycles per second, which starts to get us into an infrasonic range where we hear from about 10 cycles per second up to 22,000 cycles per second. What we hear pitches is up to 6,000 hertz. We hear timbre up to 22,000. We see in the gigahertz domain an octave, but we've now, with the computer mapped heat, which is a haptic sense, but it's chemical, with the infrared, which is a frequency we can't see. Can we make a frequency continuum, map this into our senses, and start to use this to hybridize ourselves, or even to help people that have sensory deprivation, and to have something like this instrument behind me be able to totally immerse you in this data, and being able to then scale this accordingly, because you don't have to be in the 3-story capsule to do this. You can do this in any size and any shape. But what's so interesting of having bigger ones is you can have more people in there. I mean, that's the hardest thing about VR helmets. I mean, you can only communicate. It's very hard to communicate cross-modally. And I think Ryan mentioned something called peripersonal space, which is very important. The peripersonal space is the space immediately around you. And it's not the space that you look at. It's the space where you grab for something. It's a very peripheral type of space, but we play off of people's peripersonal spaces. You can find out something about something by looking at another person and seeing how they react to whatever it is that they're seeing. So trying to have these larger spaces where we can kind of virtually immerse ourselves in this data and do virtual experimentation becomes very important, I think, in community relationships. So I think, yes, I think bringing this into the physical, bringing this into to scale, to human scale, is a very important way that we can communicate with one another.
Stuart, please.
Yeah, there was so much in what you just said, Joanne. I just wanted to kind of, I guess, offer a reflection that maybe ties some of what you and Lace were saying to an observation from Brian earlier. And your reference to hybridizing ourselves, I think, is especially resonant. And there's another way in which I guess we
hybridizing what? What did you say?
Hybridizing ourselves.
Hybridizing ourselves.
Yes, yes. But I think there's another way in which often we ourselves maybe are always already a little bit more hybrid than some of the spaces that we might be required to be in, or that we could create for ourselves. And Brian's evocation of not so much the kind of the angry animal in the corner who hasn't gotten its creativity out or whatever it might be, but certainly that feeling of having been in some basic and really troubling way required to leave large parts of what I was interested in and passionate about at the door in order to, to do a law degree and do history and philosophy of science. I did both in undergrad, and there was all of this stuff in, filmmaking, in music. I did tons of music growing up, and it all just stopped. When my formal education at the tertiary level began. My first paychecks as a kid came from singing in a musical, in a Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, actually. But all of that stuff just kind of basically was left at the door when learning to professionalize in an academic context. And I mean, maybe I would have gone a little crazy or gotten angry or something had I not sort of noticed that lack. And in the futures work that I was interested in, which was already highly transdisciplinary, welcoming of different perspectives, all of that, like it was doing a great job on those fronts. But in its efforts, and here I'm talking about the futures field as I found it in the mid 1990s, in its efforts to kind of be legible to and respectable and legitimate through the lenses of a kind of techno-managerialist paradigm in a workplace and a sort of and a scientific paradigm in academia, these other ways of doing things, artistic, design-driven, media-driven, that spoke to the body, spoke to the gut, brought the heart in, most of that stuff was just absent from the field, or certainly downplayed. And so the reason I'm offering this is because I guess I feel like what the journey that we have been on over the last 15 years to bring that stuff in has been simultaneously personal, about a kind of reintegration of stuff that got separated somehow, and collective. And it seems to me that there's a resonance or a kind of a similarity between that and the effort of this entire series and of this conversation to kind of bring things together that we have, for whatever reasons, sort of traditionally siloed.
Thank you, Stuart. I want to go back, and I know, Joanne, you have a response to that, and maybe this will lead into that. I'm happy to step aside in a moment. We've touched on the theme or the importance of play, and I would liken that to kind of taking a beginner's mind to things. I'm a pretty new parent. I have a 6-month-old, and so I've been witnessing just the importance of just open exploration and how important that is. And it brings me to a question that one of the attendees asked, and that's Keith Nesbitt's question. And Keith, we can invite you up to speak about this in a moment. But let me pull that question back up, because I think it is pretty generative, and I want to make sure we get that here. He writes, does any panelist want to comment on where computer games fit as a boundary object? They involve simulations, futurism, and play, both determined and creative, both individual and group, and a number of other elements such as storytelling and navigation. So I'll open that up, and Joanne, I'll let you have the first crack at it, since I knew you had another comment as well.
Okay, my comment is a little bit different, but maybe it does play into place. I mean, I've noticed one of our panelists isn't here that I loved, and that was our Indigenous colleague. And to start to think about these aspects of what we know and understand intuitively. And I think all of us have our roots, and I think all of us have our own areas that deal with some of the wonderful wisdoms that we've had that don't really deal with knowledge and don't really deal with learning. Maybe that does play into your new young one. And what it's like when we're first on the planet before we're filtered to believe that the 3 dimensions that we live in are all that there only are. So that does get into play, and it does get into computer games. So I'll leave it at that and open up the floor to everybody, to our new person that we're inviting forward.
So Andreas and Kati, if you're able to, I'd love if you could invite Keith up to be a panelist so he could speak about that. In the meantime, do other panelists have thoughts on the role of games as a boundary navigating object?
I guess I'll just say briefly that I kind of think in in a McLuhan-esque way about media, that each medium that through which one might explore is a different massage. And so, yes, computer games, absolutely. Also live theater, also, card games and tabletop games, also immersive experiences, also physical artifacts that you might send through the mail or whatever. I mean, that's why we've framed this practice as being experiential futures, in order to explicitly kind of refer to the idea that any experience you can create that helps you walk that boundary more effectively is fair game.
Thanks, Stuart. Keith, did you want to clarify or offer a few thoughts?
Just hoping that can you hear me okay?
We can indeed, thank you.
I'm reluctant to share my video because I've actually just been out in the yard landscaping while I'm listening. So getting my creative physical side, which I find really enjoyable to do. Yeah, I've taught computer games for a long time, and to me, it always seems to bring together people who have from different sides of the equation, whether they're wanting to do storytelling or more design, visual type things, but also this sense of play. And also you meet a lot of people who are more traditional engineers, particularly in the software engineering field, who also have that creative side, which people have talked about. So it's they are kind of a hybrid field. And that's why I personally got into computer games. For me, it seemed like the future at the time, and I guess I'm talking 20 years or so ago, of bringing together visualization, this idea of multi-sensory interaction, data, and kind of a great way to engage people in both sides of things. And the only other thing I was going to say, I think that caught my mind, was the talk around building artifacts as a group. And I know people have touched on this. That is a great way, I think, to create boundary objects. The outcomes might be unexpected, but if you're working towards a common goal and able to contribute parts of that, then what a great way to bring people together.
Thank you for sharing, Keith. Lace, I know you were.
I thought that was a really interesting comment about computer games. And I think one way in which they are special is that they can gamify anything. So, when you have a common goal, that's one thing. Everyone wants to, achieve the goal. But when there's a game component of it, people get really excited. Anytime you use a game in class, students go bananas over it. So I think there is something really special about that. And I think the other part of computer games is that I'm always, of course, thinking of simulations, but the capacity for showing the future outcomes, it can be highly rich depending on how they're developed. So I think that that's one useful element if you're not someone who wants to use your imagination as much, which can be hard for people across disciplines. Not everyone has the same practice using their imagination. So that it could be a useful support for those of us who are a little out of practice with our imaginations.
David.
Yeah, I love games, and I love playing. Basically, I love treating things in that manner, and it makes me just one or two though is I love the idea of expanding the types of games we can play to really deal with a whole wide variety of different experiences and ideas and possibilities. And at the same time, I really wish we could take some of the standard ideas of the way that we're supposed to act, like specifically at work or in our professional lives, and just bring more play into that, more game, like a sort of a gaming ethos to some of the ways that work actually happens, because it's so formal and it's so just how everything's so on the line, so much drama and it's so intense. And I feel like all of that stuff really kind of gets in the way, at least for me, of the time when I feel like I'm making the most progress, which is when I'm just kind of having fun, with the things that I love. And so I would agree with Keith that I think that it's like an incredibly powerful tool. But I hope we can learn from that tool and bring some things back into our lives to, just allow us to have a little bit more mental flexibility and, progress, I guess, or, contributions.
Thanks, David. One thing I just wanted to mention, while some of these thoughts are kind of just sitting with people, is Flourishing Salons is meant to be a continued living conversation. And so we convene these sessions, and I think they're very exciting, but we also want to sustain the discussion. And so one of the ways that we're trying to do that now is just to give people a space to kind of continue interacting with the people they meet during these salons. And so I just posted a link to a Slack space that we're starting to develop, where you can stay in touch. And I welcome anyone to reach out to me as well. So these are very living conversations, and it doesn't have to be completed here. I know after I leave these discussions, there's always a lot of things that I'm writing down, things in my notes that I start to reflect on. So I hope people will do that as well. I do want to open it up if people have further thoughts. I know there's a lot floating around here. Brian, it looks like maybe you have something to contribute.
Yeah, I wanted to sort of follow up on what Joanne was talking about in Indigenous knowledge. And also you had mentioned a book called Braiding Sweetwater by author Kimmerer, I believe her name is. Yeah, and she talks about the grammar of animacy, that we oftentimes as scientists, we look at the world and we see like that's a person, those are living things, those people. But then we look at other objects, whether it's a rock or a tree, and it's an it. It's usually not a living thing. So she got trained as a botanist, but that she had her Potawatomi language that she used to explain things that the botanist and the taxidermists, no, the taxonomers, that they not the taxidermists, but the taxonomers, and how we label things, not as living things, but as an object that doesn't necessarily have a life. And so this idea of grammar of animacy that she put forward is really powerful, because it's not only does it have the name of the species that you're looking at, whether it's a mushroom or whether it's a molecule or a freon or whatever it might be, but that thing has that thing that we're looking at can be explained in other ways. She uses this phrase, I think it's pupawi. Pupawi is a Potawatomi phrase, and it's the force which pushes the mushroom out. I think that's what it is. The force that pushes the mushroom out of the ground during the night when like no one's looking at it. And Dylan Thomas talks a little bit about the green fuse that animates nature and all that, but there's no technical vocabulary for this phrase. That Western science doesn't really have the language yet to explain that process. And so I just really love that in looking at Indigenous knowledge and ways for us to understand things through this grammar of animacy, that looking at things, because it creates more of an empathy for other things. It creates a deeper relationship between the trees that I'm looking at, the stars that I'm observing, and the microfractal experience that a lot of our friends here have on campus in the quantum world. So I like this idea that pupawi, this force which pushes up the mushroom, from the ground. Like, how do you explain that? So I like the idea of using more taxonomies, like new ways, or maybe ancient ways, ancient knowledge, ancient wisdom, to inform our sort of Western secular definitions of things in ways. I think it opens up the world and it creates more empathy between people, which I think creates more community.
Brian, I love it. And Braiding Sweetgrass is one of the most affecting works that I've read in the past few years. Certainly, I recommend that to everyone. Probably one of my most gifted books over the past few years. Actually relates closely to what you were mentioning, and it's something that she wrote in that book that really sticks with me. And I think I pulled up the quote here, or this might be loosely quoted, but she says our cosmologies serve as our source of identity and our orientation in the world. And then related to this conversation, she writes that the work of living is taking this orientation and creating a map for ourselves. And I like the way that book talks about, our maps. We tend to think of our maps as these very concrete things with these set boundaries, and we kind of classify them and, as you mentioned, labeled them. But in terms of mapping what we don't know, it really is about confronting this idea of a fuzzy map or a fuzzy label, or even avoiding the label and being okay, as I think Stuart was mentioning, being okay with that, with not having a great label for that. And I just think that's really important. It's something that sticks with me.
I'll just quickly jump in here. Doing research on uncertainty and communicating uncertainty, there's certainly different cultures that have different relationships with uncertainty. And, many places that have greater experience with extreme hazards have come to terms with much of what's going to happen to them being more uncertain. And I think that's something that other cultures tend to be very uncomfortable with. And so they are less interested in doing risk mitigation measures because they're so nervous about the thing, rather than finding a different language or metaphor or way of dealing with the unknown. And I think that's something that different disciplines could help our culture sort out to become more accustomed to not knowing as a
So like more confident
way.
to give to the other phrases or other terminology or other ways of knowing to help us, and to not feel so nervous about the thing that we're discussing. Like, I need some help in a sense to describe something. Is that what you mean? Like finding other ways of.
Yes, and being comfortable with not knowing. I don't know why we have this feeling like we should know. I mean, I have it too. no judgment, but it's that's certainly not the only way of interacting with the world. I don't have the answers of how to get there, but it's certainly something that would be useful when we think about different ways of interacting with the future.
I appreciate that you brought that perspective of uncertainty quantification, that scientific approach to this, because I've noticed, for instance, New Zealand and Australia, in my personal experience, I've noticed having this different sensibility of being able to live and being okay with risk, which is a component of resilience, I think, which is, obviously something we're trying to create with flourishing systems. There's a different sensibility when you just have lived with risk and being exposed to extreme events just being something that happens. And so I appreciate that perspective, Lace. We're coming towards the end of the time here. This has been a really enriching conversation. I appreciate everyone's contribution to it. The way that I'd like to kind of close today is something that David and I have been chatting about lately with JD Talasek from the Cultural Programs to the National Academy of Sciences. And it's the idea that some of these Flourishing Salons discussions could emerge these really ripe topics to explore in a more actionable way and kind of a more maybe a different format. And one of the things we've talked about is something that's very much an early idea, but it's called wonder workshops. How do we take some of these really potent ideas and continue the interaction and energize people to act towards them? So I'd like to maybe just have a few minute discussion about what topics or themes would you love to see move forward into a wonder workshop, or what would you be excited to contribute to? And I'll open that generally for anyone to open their mics and contribute, or put your comments in the chat if you'd like, if you're not a panelist.
Well, go ahead, Joanne.
I was just going to say, for me, I have one, and it's one very interesting thing, and it's hard because a lot of my physicists don't want to talk about it, but it deals with quantum consciousness. So I'm just going to leave that out there hanging, and I'll let Brian go forward.
What is the wonder? What is the stuff? Yeah, I've never played Minecraft, so I'm so from that point of view. But I think people love games because people are competitive too. Fuzzy mapping, it's okay to not. So what is the? So what was the question again exactly? How is that? What is? I'm sorry. There's just so much. I'm looking at Joanne Gutierrez, the Allosphere, the deeper integration of art and science. I mean, there's so many great links in this chat too. So I've been kind of clicking on some of these as well. But what exactly, could you ask the question again, Ryan? Sorry.
Sure, and I feel the same way. It is, these conversations can be a bit of a fire hose. So I do try and capture this in a structured way in the notes so that you can refer back to them. I hope that's useful. Feel free to contribute to those. The question is, if we were to choose some themes that are emerging from this that we'd like to move forward and have a longer conversation, maybe even a different structure to the conversation around what might you be excited to contribute to?
What I might be versus who I want to work with. Yeah, I'd like to do more workshop, like experiential physical workshops with people. I mean, that would be, that's where kind of I live with people, is just developing different kinds of workshops through the senses. I do a lot of like conflict resolution, not that this group needs, resolution of conflict, but of that space where we bring our physical body, our embodied knowledge within a situation where we maybe find a topic amongst us that we're all super curious about, that we can dig into through the body and through sound. And maybe music is involved with that as well. But I'm really interested in, I guess Wagner talked about the Gesamtkunstwerk, like this total work of art that kind of takes in all these senses in a way, and allows us this space to explore it all in a real sensual way. Do you know what I mean? Sensual in that all of our senses are excited, and all of these frames of knowledge that we operate and understand through, linguistic or kinesthetic or spatial or conceptual, that bringing into this, our experience together as a group, these sort of physical exercises or physical workshops, these psychophysical workshops that are part, embodied and part verbal, and how it interacts with sound. But also, I keep going back to, how do I understand condensed matter physics, or non-equilibrium dynamics through the body? How does the body understand that in some way? So I'm really interested in a lot of the physical aspects, especially a lot of my colleagues here, in Grant Redmond, who's on one of the participants on this as well. Like, how can we take some of these really deep, some of these deeper, the conceptual frameworks, and open them up through different means of intelligence? Do you know what I mean? Like, take something that we're all like, it's really intimidating to some people, and see if we can kind of crack it open in some way as a group. I don't know, that'd be fun.
Wonderful. Thank you, Brian. Joanne, please.
Love everybody to come to the Alisphere. Let's do an Alisphere.
Road trip.
Count me in.
Road trip. Let's get the band together, man.
Stuart, while you're here, you should go to Santa Barbara. Joanne, I would love to come.
Yes, Stuart, please, man. SB is a wonderful place. It's a wonderful place. We can drink some good wine, and we can be immersed in whatever we want to be immersed in.
Yeah,
actually,
embodiment and wine tasting together seem like they would go really well.
Yeah, you got it.
Yeah, actually, there are two participants on here, Joanne, that I want to introduce you to, and they're both up in Santa Barbara. One is Cole Redmond, and one is Grant Redmond. And Grant is getting his PhD in the theater world, and Grant is working on his his postdoc in theoretical physics. So I'd like to introduce you two to meet up in there as well, and maybe
absolutely.
we could do like a road trip.
KITP is right next to the room. I'm in the CNSI, and I have people from KITP over all the time.
There you
David
go.
Gross and I were like that.
I love it.
Come on down.
I'd love to meet you. Yeah, we should get together.
Absolutely.
That'd be fantastic. I also would love to visit the Alisphere, Joanne. That'd be fantastic. This has been a wonderful conversation. I want to make sure that we're respectful of the time of the 24-hour event. I encourage people to take a look at the programming that Kati's put together. Kati and Todd actually put together. It's wonderful. There are discussions like this happening throughout the previous several hours, and going through tomorrow at noon, I believe. So with that, I will thank everyone for making time available on your Saturday, for bringing your wonderful thoughts to this, and for contributing to the discussion. I'll hand it back off to Kati and Andreas and Todd. Thank you again.